because I want to talk about universal basic income and the idea of money for nothing. So what is universal basic income? So universal basic income is essentially a tax-free stipend that you get just for existing. So that sounds great. So essentially, the government pays you, I don't know, $2,000 a month just for living in this country. And this is important because it allows the government to provide for people's basic needs, to look at, to make sure that everyone has the very basics. So the universal basic income is essentially meant to cover, at the very least, and what I call basic income, is your housing, your food, your utilities, and any other kind of expenses that you need to live. So if we were to get something like this in America, it would fundamentally transform the economy. Not just because people would have more money to spend on other things, but also because, workers would be empowered. So what do I mean by that? So when you guys talked about, oftentimes the argument, well, you're going to give people money to do nothing at all. And so the reason that that's brought up is to kind of make you is to make you have the reactionary thought of, you can't have money, you can't have a decent life unless you earn it. You can only earn it by, working your fingers to the bone and working a job you don't like, and just keep trudging through and never having any time to do anything other than work. But because that's the propaganda that we're taught our whole lives. If you work hard, you'll do well. If you work hard, if you work hard, if you work hard, if you get a good job, if you get promoted, right? But really, the answer is I reject that framing, because it actually is a good thing for people to get money for not doing anything, because if they do, then they will have more opportunities to do things that they love doing. I always think, when I think about universal basic income, I always think about the old promise of capitalism, which is that by working these jobs, by, existing in this system that attempts to create more growth and more efficiency, is that eventually we'll work less. We'll enjoy our lives more. The promise of capitalism was to work less and live more. But that's not been the case. The case has been that the capitalist class, the bourgeois, have constantly, the owners of the means of production, have constantly squeezed more labor out of their workers and have made our living conditions more and more disparate. It has been harder to pay rent. It has been harder to pay utilities. The prices go up, but wages don't. There's that old cartoon from, I think, the 1920s, where a man is squished between two wooden platforms, and the top one says high rent, and the bottom one says, the top one says low wages, and the bottom one says high rent. And the capitalist is up there screwing them tighter and tighter and squeezing the worker more and more. This is what's happening. And it's the same thing that's happening now that had been happening all the way back in the 1920s. For the most part, people's standard of living, even if it's gone up, hasn't gone up by so much that they've really started to enjoy life, that they've had the opportunity to do other things. Money for nothing gives the power to the worker, because it says, well, actually, I have enough to live, to pay rent. Now, maybe I don't have enough to go on vacation, or I don't have enough to go out to fancy restaurants and things, or to buy luxury goods, or even to buy extra consumer goods that I want. But any income I make on top of this basic income is disposable for the most part. My basic needs are met. And by the way, just a quick aside on that, UBI would have to be different based on the cost of living in different places. But $2,000 a month typically would cover people's basics for most areas of the country. Obviously, there's some places where that wouldn't be true, and UBI would have to be higher, but that aside. So workers then have the opportunity to say, actually, I don't want to work. I want to paint all day, or I want to sit in my garden and read every book I can possibly get my hands on from the library all day. or I want to bake bread and give it to my neighbors all day, or I want to play video games all day, or I want to write books and not have to worry about the profit margin or my side hustle or whatever. I want to garden for a living. Not even for a living. I want to garden for fun. That's what I want to do with my life. We give all these options back to workers, and then the corporations have to respond by creating a workplace environment that's actually welcoming. So instead of paying you a starvation wage, they actually have to pay you a real wage. They have to give you real benefits. They have to make maybe all work becomes part-time or something like that. Companies then have to start appealing to workers as opposed to the other way around. Right now, if you want a job, you have to appeal to a company and say, yes, I will work super hard for you, and I'll work weekends, and I'll never take any time off, and I'll come in when I'm sick, and I'll work 16-hour days. I mean, I don't know how people work in 16-hour days, but you get the idea, right? You have to ingratiate yourself to the great corporation. But if the system was the other way around, you wouldn't have to do that. Companies would have to ingratiate themselves to workers. They'd say, "Oh, workers, well, we need you," and they would need to create an environment that's safe, that's friendly, that's welcoming, that's fun, that's enjoyable for workers, because all work would be voluntary. Nowadays, we have what's often referred to as wage slavery, whereas people are indentured to their employers because the wages are so low they barely cover anything. So you work harder and harder and more jobs in order to make sure that you have, to make sure that you can pay your bills. But if your bills are already covered and there's no need for you to work, the power dynamics change fundamentally. So I am in full support of people receiving money for nothing. I'm in full support of people who don't want to work for a living. I think that in 2021, you should have the option to sit at home and not work if you don't want to. And that's not a crazy thing. We should normalize a culture where work isn't everything. If you want to work, the conditions that you work should be up to you for the most part. Obviously, if you really believe in a company's purpose, you don't want to work extra and things like that, that's on you. But that's the point. It should be on the worker. The worker should be making these decisions for themselves. And this doesn't just occur in places where there's a union or places where there are employee-owned companies. This can occur because the worker actually has the power to say, no, I refuse. I'm not going to work at a job that pays me starvation wages, that makes me work in dangerous working conditions. I don't have to. My basic needs are met. I'm gonna sit in a park and read books all day instead. If this factory wants to hire me, if this factory wants me to work for it, then they can create a situation that is going to be safe and comfortable for me to work in. And if they're not willing to do that, then they can go bankrupt because they'll have no workers to make their goods. And if that was the case, you would see a fundamental shift in the way that work and labor is understood in this country and in all countries. There have been so many studies that show, and I want to get to the other argument that's brought up to it. I just want to address really quickly because I think it's kind of stupid. Is, people just get lazy. If you just give them money, they'll be lazy. No, they won't be. What's funny is, first of all, there's tons of studies just proving this, and that people take the money they get from UBI and they save it and they spend it appropriately, and they buy themselves better living conditions and things like that. As if you have to spend it on any such thing. It's your money, you can spend it on whatever you want. But the thing is, it's not that people will be lazy. It's that people will be lazy if you only see laziness through the eye of creating capital for the capitalist class, right? The person who stays at home and reads books all day, they're not being lazy. Or the person who plays video games all day, they're not being lazy. They are doing something. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with being lazy. You don't have to produce. You don't have to work all the time. This is a cultural problem that we have where we believe that everything has to be tied to work. No, reject that. Let universal basic income be the way that we go. And let's move to a place where the workers control whether they are going to whether they are going to work or not, how they're going to spend their days, and how they're going to be productive. Because being productive doesn't just mean creating capital for the capitalist class. It can mean anything. And the more that we recognize that truth, the happier we'll become and the less we'll feel like we're overworked.